The year was 1943. Captain Robert Iron Mackenzie gripped the control yoke of his P-47 Thunderbolt as it roared through the German sky at 400 miles per hour. Below him, the industrial heart of the Third Reich, the ball-bearing factories of Schweinfurt, burned from the morning's bombing raid. His wingman's voice crackled through the radio. "Iron bogies, 6 o'clock high, Focke-Wulf's coming in fast!" In that moment, Mackenzie had exactly 3 seconds to make a decision that would either save his life or end it. He pushed the yoke forward with both hands and entered what pilots called God's elevator. But this wasn't just any dive. This was a vertical plunge into what seemed like the jaws of death itself, a maneuver so terrifying, so physically punishing, that it earned its divine nickname from the men who survived it, and many didn't survive. Let me tell you what happens to a human body during a dive that pilots called God's elevator. You're not just falling, you're commanding an 8-ton machine to plummet toward the earth at speeds that make the aircraft scream and shudder. As you push that yoke forward, the negative G-forces make your blood rush to your head. Your eyes feel like they're being pushed out of their sockets. Everything that isn't strapped down maps, pencils, spent shell casings floats upward, hitting the canopy above you. But here's the shocking part. You're not just fighting physics, you're fighting your own survival instinct. Every fiber of your being is screaming at you to pull up, to escape, to fly UP and away from the German fighters. But in God's elevator, salvation lies in the opposite direction. You must dive toward the earth, hurling yourself downward at a rate of 15,000 feet per minute. That's nearly 3 miles of altitude lost in 60 seconds. Captain Mackenzie knew this maneuver. He'd seen it demonstrated once by a veteran pilot back in England. But watching someone else do it is nothing compared to doing it yourself, with German cannons trying to blow you out of the sky. The term God's elevator wasn't born in a training manual or at a tactics meeting. It was coined in the winter of 1942 by a pilot named Lieutenant Jake Preacher Holland, a former divinity school student from Georgia who joined the Army Air Corps after Pearl Harbor. The story goes that Holland was caught by 3 Messerschmitt Bf-109 seconds over occupied France. Outnumbered and outgunned, he did something desperate. He rolled his P-47 inverted and pulled, or rather pushed, into a near-vertical dive. The dive was so steep, so violent, that his wingman thought he'd been hit and was going down. But Holland hadn't been hit. He'd made a choice. As he later explained in the officers' club that night, his hands still shaking as he held his whiskey. "I figured God gave me 2 options. Get shot to pieces by Jerry, or trust that the Almighty would stop my fall before I hit the ground. So I stepped into his elevator and pressed the button marked down. Fastest ride of my life." He survived. The German fighters couldn't follow the dive. Their aircraft weren't built for it. They'd either rip apart from the stress, or the pilots would black out from the G-forces. Within weeks, every fighter pilot in the European theater knew about Holland's maneuver, and they all called it the same thing: God's elevator. But what they didn't know, what Holland never told them until much later, was that during that dive, he'd actually blacked out for 3 seconds. 3 seconds where he wasn't in control. 3 seconds where only God, physics, and pure luck kept him from becoming a crater in the French countryside. By 1943, the skies over Europe had become the most dangerous place on Earth. The Luftwaffe was desperate, skilled, and ruthless. Their Focke-Wulf 190 seconds and Messerschmitt 109 seconds were faster and more maneuverable than anything America had at the start of the war. In the first 6 months of the bombing campaign, the United States lost over 1,000 aircraft. The math was simple and brutal. If you were jumped by German fighters, your chances of survival depended on one thing: could you escape the initial attack? If they got on your tail, you had seconds to act. Try to outturn them, and they'd cut you to pieces. Try to outrun them, and they'd chase you down. But dive hard enough, fast enough, steep enough, the P-47 Thunderbolt could take it. The big, heavy fighter was built like a tank. It could survive dives that would tear lighter aircraft apart. The problem was the pilot. Could you take it? Back to Captain Mackenzie. Three Focke-Wulf 192nds were diving on him from above, their 20mm cannons and machine guns ready to shred his aircraft. He'd been separated from his formation during the bombing run. Now, he was alone, 23,000 feet above hostile territory, with German aces closing in for the kill. Iron to any Thunderbolt. "I'm engaged. 3 bandits. Need assistance," he called out. Static. His radio was damaged. The first German opened fire. Tracer rounds arced past Mackenzie's canopy, glowing red streaks that seemed to move in slow motion. One round clipped his left wing, punching a hole the size of a fist through the metal. Mackenzie had one chance, one move, one prayer. He pushed the yoke forward with everything he had. The nose of the Thunderbolt dropped like a stone falling off a cliff. The engine screamed as the propeller bit into the denser air. The airspeed indicator spun clockwise 250 miles per hour, 300, 350, 400. The negative G-forces hit him like a hammer. His stomach lurched into his throat. His vision immediately began to deteriorate as blood pooled in his head. He could feel his eyeballs being pushed forward against their sockets. Tears streamed from his eyes, not from emotion, but from pure physical stress. 18,000 feet, 15,000 feet, 12,000 feet. Behind him, the 3 German fighters tried to follow. But here's the shocking truth about God's elevator. It wasn't designed to escape the enemy. It was designed to make the enemy destroy themselves trying to follow you. The lead Focke-Wulf pilot pushed into a dive trying to keep his gun sight on the American. But the FW-190, while fast, wasn't built for this kind of punishment. At 450 miles per hour in a near-vertical dive, the airframe began to shake. The controls locked up. The pilot, experiencing G-forces his body couldn't handle, began to gray out. He pulled up. He had to. If he didn't, he'd either pass out or his aircraft would disintegrate. But Mackenzie kept diving. 10,000 feet. 8,000 feet, 6,000 feet. The German landscape below fields, roads, a small village began to take shape. He could see individual buildings now, tiny squares of color in the brown and green patchwork of the countryside. 5,000 feet, 4,000 feet. His altimeter was unwinding so fast, it was almost useless. He was navigating by instinct now. By feel, by something primal that told him how close the ground was. 3,000 feet, 2,000, 500 feet. Every muscle in his body was tensed, waiting for the moment. Not yet, not yet. 2,000 feet. Now, Mackenzie pulled back on the yoke with both hands, using every ounce of strength in his arms and shoulders. The G-forces reversed instantly negative to positive in a heartbeat. The change was so violent, so sudden, that his vision went from red-tinged to gray to almost black. The force pinned him to his seat like a giant hand pressing down on his chest. He could feel his flight suit cutting into his legs. His oxygen mask felt like it weighed 50 pounds. But the Thunderbolt responded. The nose came up. The horizon appeared, tilted crazily at first, then leveling out. The altimeter showed 800 feet. 800 feet. Less than the length of 3 football fields between him and death. Above him, the German fighters circled, unable to follow, probably radioing to ground forces about the crazy American pilot who'd just ridden God's elevator all the way to the ground floor. Mackenzie leveled out and pushed the throttle forward, skimming over the German countryside at treetop level. His hands were shaking. His heart was hammering so hard he thought it might burst. His vision was still spotted with dark blotches. But he was alive. He'd just taken his first ride on God's elevator. And as he pointed his Thunderbolt west toward England, he realized something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He'd have to do it again. Tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that. Because the war wasn't over. The missions would continue. And sooner or later, every fighter pilot over Europe would have to make a choice. Face the enemy, or trust God's elevator to save them. And God's elevator didn't always reach the ground floor. Sometimes it went all the way down to the basement. 6 weeks before Captain Mackenzie's successful dive, another pilot named Lieutenant William Wild Bill Harrigan executed the exact same maneuver. He'd been jumped by 4 Messerschmitt 109 seconds over the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland. Harrigan was known throughout the 56th Fighter Group as fearless, some said reckless. He'd shot down 7 German aircraft and had the swagger to prove it. When those Messerschmitts came screaming down on him, Harrigan didn't hesitate. He rolled his P-47 and pushed into God's elevator. 20,000 feet, 15,000 feet, 10,000 feet. His wingman, Lieutenant Pete Carson, watched from above. He watched Harrigan's Thunderbolt plummet like a stone. He watched the dive steepen. He watched. And then he stopped watching because he couldn't bear to see what came next. At 8,000 feet, Harrigan's aircraft should have started to pull out. At 5,000 feet, it was mandatory. At 3,000 feet, it was desperate. But Wild Bill Harrigan's P-47 never pulled out of the dive. It maintained that same near-vertical angle all the way into a wheat field outside Dusseldorf. The impact created a crater 30 feet deep. When the British Army reached the site 6 months later after the Allied advance, they found pieces of the aircraft scattered over 200 yards. Of Lieutenant Harrigan himself, they found almost nothing. At over 500 miles per hour, the human body simply ceases to exist upon impact. He was 22 years old. He'd been engaged to a girl named Sarah back in Michigan. She received the telegram 3 days later. It said he'd been killed in action over Germany. It didn't mention God's elevator. It didn't mention that he'd essentially flown himself into the ground at terminal velocity. Here's what the Army Air Corps didn't tell the American public during World War II. Between 1942 and 1945, they lost 423 fighters to what they officially classified as uncontrolled dives or structural failure during evasive action. That's 423 pilots who entered God's elevator and never came back up. But here's the truly shocking part. Detailed analysis after the war revealed that in at least 180 of those cases, there was nothing mechanically wrong with the aircraft. The planes were intact. The controls functional. These pilots had simply failed to pull out in time. Why? The reasons were as varied as the men who died. Target fixation so focused on escaping the enemy that they forgot about the ground rushing up to meet them. Spatial disorientation in the chaos of combat. With their inner ear screaming conflicting information, they literally couldn't tell which way was up. G-force-induced loss of consciousness, the negative Gs during the initial dive, or the crushing positive Gs during the pullout, caused them to black out. Equipment failure, oxygen systems that malfunctioned, leaving pilots hypoxic and unable to think clearly. And perhaps most tragic of all, simple miscalculation. Starting the dive too low, or waiting too long to pull out, leaving physics no time to save them. The mathematics were brutal. Every pilot knew that if you were jumped by enemy fighters at altitude, you had 3 options: fight, run, or dive. Fighting against superior numbers usually meant death. Running rarely worked. The German fighters were too fast, too skilled. That left the dive. But the dive had its own odds. Based on combat records from 1943 to 1944, a pilot executing God's elevator had approximately a 12% chance of not recovering from the maneuver. 12%. 1 in 8. Now multiply that by the number of missions. The average fighter pilot flew 50 combat missions. If you had to use God's elevator just twice during those missions, and most pilots used it far more often, your cumulative chance of dying in a dive reached over 20%. 1 in 5. Those were the real odds of surviving the war as a fighter pilot. The 352nd Fighter Group, stationed at RAF Bodney in England, became known by an unofficial nickname that nobody used in official reports: the Elevator Squadron. Between February and August, 1944, they lost 19 pilots to dive-related incidents. 19 men who'd survived being shot at, survived anti-aircraft fire, survived mid-air collisions and mechanical failures only to die in a maneuver designed to save them. Captain Thomas Doc Henley, the squadron flight surgeon, began keeping detailed notes. What he documented was chilling. After reviewing pilot reports and interviewing survivors, he identified a pattern. The first time a pilot used God's elevator and survived, they felt invincible. Adrenaline, relief, and the sheer thrill of survival created a dangerous confidence. The second and third times, the confidence remained. But small cracks began to appear. Nightmares, intrusive thoughts, a slight hesitation before climbing into the cockpit. By the fourth or fifth time, the psychological damage became severe. Pilots reported vivid dreams of falling, of the ground rushing up, of pulling on the stick, and nothing happening. Some started drinking heavily. Others developed nervous tics, trembling hands, rapid blinking, an inability to focus. And by the sixth time or beyond, something broke. Doc Henley called it dive fatigue, though the psychiatrist would later recognize it as a form of acute combat stress reaction, what we now call PTSD. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, a 4-year-old pilot from Ohio, described it in a letter to his brother. "Each time I push that stick forward, Tommy, I wonder if this is the time I don't pull up. Not because I can't, but because some part of me, some deep, exhausted part, just wants it to be over." You fight and fight and fight, and then one day you're in that dive and you think, what if I just close my eyes? What if I just let go? It's not that I want to die. It's that I'm so damn tired of being afraid of dying. 3 weeks after writing that letter, Lieutenant Webb was killed when his P-47 failed to recover from a dive over France. The official report stated probable mechanical failure, but his wingman told a different story to Doc Henley. Off the record, he had plenty of altitude, plenty of time. I saw him go in. And Doc, I don't think he was trying to pull out. I think he just had enough. It was March 6th, 1944. The 352nd Fighter Group was scheduled to escort B-17 bombers to Berlin, the most heavily defended target in Europe. Every pilot in that ready room knew what the next day would bring. The Luftwaffe would throw everything they had at the bomber stream. And when the fighters came, God's elevator would be the only escape. 23 pilots attended the briefing that night. Captain Mackenzie was among them. Now a flight leader, with 4 7 missions under his belt. He'd used God's elevator 8 times. 8 times he'd pushed his aircraft into that near-vertical dive. 8 times he'd bet his life that he could pull out before hitting the ground. The intelligence officer's briefing was grim. Expect 200 to 300 German fighters. They'll hit the bomber formation in waves. Your job is to keep them off the bombers. If you get jumped, brake hard and use altitude. Recommended defensive maneuver, aggressive diving attack to disengage. Aggressive diving attack to disengage. The sanitized, official term for God's elevator. After the briefing, the pilots sat in the mess hall. Nobody was eating. Captain Henry Hank Morrison, a quiet man from Iowa who'd survived 63 missions, finally spoke. "You know, the Germans have a saying about us. They call American pilots der Turmspringer, the tower divers. They've figured out what we're doing, and they've figured out how to counter it." "Counter it how?" someone asked. "They don't chase us down anymore," Morrison replied. "They just wait. They know if they chase us into a dive, we'll escape. So now they just circle above and wait for us to climb back up. And if we don't climb back up, well, they know we're not coming back up at all." The room fell silent. Everyone understood what he was saying. God's elevator had stopped being an escape. It had become a trap. Dive to escape the Germans, or stay high and fight impossible odds. Either way, the chances of survival were getting slimmer. Lieutenant James Jimmy Doyle, a 20-year-old replacement pilot on his 5th mission, asked the question nobody wanted to answer. "So what do we do?" Captain Mackenzie looked at the young pilot, looked at his smooth, unlined face, his eyes still bright with something that might have been hope. or might have been naivety, and said, "We do our jobs, Lieutenant. We climb into our birds tomorrow morning, we fly to Berlin, and we bring those bomber boys home. And if Jerry jumps us, we do what we've always done." "We ride the elevator?" Jimmy asked quietly. Mackenzie nodded. "We ride the elevator." That night, none of them slept. Some wrote letters home. Some played cards with shaking hands. Some just sat in silence, staring at nothing, thinking about the morning. And some, though nobody would admit it, until years later, made peace with the fact that they might not be coming back. The next morning, 23 P-47 Thunderbolts took off from RAF Botany. They climbed through the gray English clouds, formed up, and turned east toward Germany, toward Berlin, toward whatever waited for them in the sky. By that evening, only 19 returned. 4 pilots were gone. 4 friends. 4 men who'd had breakfast together that morning, who'd joked nervously while checking their aircraft, who'd given thumbs-up signals as they taxied out to the runway. 2 were confirmed killed in aerial combat shot down by German fighters in straight dogfights. 1 was listed as missing in action, his fate unknown. But the fourth was Lieutenant Jimmy Doyle, the young replacement pilot who'd asked what they were supposed to do. Witnesses said he was jumped by 2 Messerschmitt 109 seconds at 18,000 feet. They said he executed a perfect defensive dive textbook God's elevator technique. They said the dive looked controlled all the way down. They also said he started pulling out at 2,000 feet, plenty of altitude, plenty of time, but then something happened. The nose came up slightly, then dropped again, as if he'd started to recover, then changed his mind. The P-47 impacted a forest in eastern Germany at full speed. Was it mechanical failure? Target fixation? Did he black out? Or, and this is the question that haunted Captain Mackenzie for the rest of his life, did Jimmy Doyle, on his 5th mission, simply decide he couldn't ride God's elevator anymore? Nobody knows. The official report listed it as aircraft lost during combat operations. But the pilots knew. They'd all felt it. That moment in the dive, when it would be so easy to just let go, to stop fighting, to accept the inevitable. God's elevator didn't just take you down, it tempted you to stay down. And sometimes, exhausted, terrified, broken men accepted that temptation. April 14th, 1944. Captain Robert Mackenzie was leading a flight of 8 P-47 Thunderbolts at 25,000 feet over Hamburg when the Messerschmitts hit them. Not 2 or 3 14 German fighters diving out of the sun in a coordinated attack. "Break! Break! Break!" Mackenzie shouted into his radio. The formation scattered. Within seconds, the sky became a swirling chaos of aircraft, tracer fire, and screaming engines. Mackenzie rolled hard left, a German fighter flashing past his canopy so close he could see the pilot's face. Then he saw something that changed everything. 2 P-47 seconds ahead of him, both entered God's elevator simultaneously, diving to escape, pursuing Messerschmitts. The German fighters didn't follow. Instead, they did something Mackenzie had never seen before. They climbed. They gained altitude and simply waited. 30 seconds later, both American fighters began their pullout. That's when the Germans dove. They'd timed it perfectly. The American pilots, fighting crushing G-forces and grayed-out vision during the pullout, never saw them coming. Both P-47 seconds were shot down within 5 seconds of recovering from their dives. Mackenzie watched it happen, and in that moment, he understood. The Luftwaffe had figured out God's elevator's fatal flaw. When you pull out of a dive, that moment when you haul back on the stick with everything you have, you enter what pilots call the gray. The positive G-forces are so intense that blood drains from your brain. Your vision tunnels, then dims, then sometimes goes completely black for a few seconds. During those seconds, you're blind, helpless. Your aircraft is flying straight and level, but you can't see threats. You can't maneuver. You can't defend yourself. You're a sitting duck. The Germans had figured this out. Luftwaffe tactical manuals recovered after the war confirmed it. When the American enters his characteristic escape dive, do not follow. Instead, Maintain altitude and observe his recovery point. At the moment of pullout, dive and attack. The American pilot will be incapacitated by G-forces and unable to defend. They'd turned God's elevator into God's execution chamber. Mackenzie realized that dozens, maybe hundreds of American pilots had been killed this way. Pilots who'd survived the dive itself, only to be shot down seconds later while blind and defenseless. The official reports called them shot down in combat. But the truth was darker. They'd been systematically hunted using their own survival technique against them. Back in the swirling dogfight over Hamburg, Mackenzie had seconds to make a decision. A Messerschmitt was on his tail, cannons firing. He could feel the impacts, metal tearing, his aircraft shuddering. He had to dive. There was no other option, but now he knew. If he dove, the German would just wait and kill him during the pullout. Unless Mackenzie pushed the stick forward and entered God's elevator. But this time, he did something different, something insane. He didn't pull out at 2,000 feet. He didn't pull out at 1,500 feet. At 1,000 feet, barely enough altitude for a parachute to open, he was still diving. The ground filled his windscreen. Individual buildings. Trees. A farmer's field, with a horse running in panic from the screaming aircraft above. 500 feet. His altimeter was useless now. He was navigating by pure instinct, by the primal terror that told him death was half a second away. 300 feet. Then he pulled. He pulled so hard, the control stick bent. The G-forces slammed him into his seat with the force of a car crash. His vision didn't gray, it went completely black. Blood vessels burst in his eyes. His oxygen mask felt like it weighed 100 pounds. But the Thunderbolt responded. The nose came up. The aircraft leveled out at 75 feet, the height of a 7-story building. Behind him, the German pilot had followed into the dive, confident of an easy kill during Mackenzie's recovery. But Mackenzie's recovery happened so low, so late, that the German had no time to react. While Mackenzie was pulling out at 75 feet, the Messerschmitt was still diving at 200 feet. The German pilot never pulled out. His aircraft impacted a field at over 400 miles per hour. Mackenzie had won. But he'd won by gambling everything. By taking God's elevator not just to the ground floor, but to the basement, the sub-basement, to the very foundation of creation itself. That evening, back at RAF Bodney, Mackenzie told Doc Henley and the other pilots what he'd discovered. The room fell silent as he explained the German tactic and his desperate countermaneuver. "You pulled out at 75 feet?" someone asked, incredulous. "I didn't have a choice," Mackenzie replied. "It's either that or let them shoot you down during recovery." "But Bob," Doc Henley said quietly, 75 feet? That's suicide. One mistake, 1 second of hesitation, and you're dead." "I know," Mackenzie said. "But here's the thing, if we keep pulling out at 2,000 feet like we've been trained, we're dead anyway. The Germans are waiting for us. They've got us figured out." The implications were staggering. To survive God's elevator, pilots now had to take it even lower, even faster, even more dangerously than before. They had to compress their margin of error to literally nothing. Within a week, every fighter squadron in the 8th Air Force knew about the German tactic and Mackenzie's countermaneuver. Some pilots tried it. Some succeeded, and some didn't. Lieutenant Karl Hoffmann attempted the ultra-low pullout over France. He waited too long by less than half a second. His P-47 clipped the top of a church steeple at 40 feet, cartwheeled, and exploded. Captain James Reed tried it over Belgium. He pulled out successfully at 60 feet, but the G-forces were so extreme that he had a stroke in the cockpit. He managed to crash land in Allied territory, but never flew again. He was 26 years old. The survival rate of God's elevator, already grim, got worse. Now pilots had to choose. Pull out at normal altitude and risk being shot down by waiting Germans, or pull out at suicidal altitude and risk killing themselves. God's elevator had stopped being a escape route. It had become a death sentence with 2 different execution methods. And the war wasn't even close to being over. May 8th, 1945. The war in Europe had only hours left. In a few short moments, Germany would surrender unconditionally. But at 0800 hours that morning, nobody knew that yet. And Captain Robert Mackenzie was about to ride God's elevator one final time. He'd survived 97 combat missions far beyond the required 50. He'd used God's elevator 23 times. 23 times he'd pushed his aircraft into that near vertical dive. 23 times he'd gambled everything on his ability to pull out before the ground claimed him. The odds had been against him from the start. By every statistical model, every probability calculation, Robert Mackenzie should have been dead a dozen times over. But he wasn't. Not yet. The mission briefing was routine, almost insultingly so, for what would be the last day of the war. Escort a final bombing run against German positions near the Czech border. Intelligence indicated minimal Luftwaffe activity. Most German fighters were grounded due to fuel shortages. The briefing officer actually said the words, "Should be a milk run, gentlemen." Mackenzie led a flight of 6 P-47 seconds. Among them was Lieutenant Tommy Bright, a 19-year-old replacement pilot on his third mission. The kid reminded Mackenzie of Jimmy Doyle, that same eager energy, that same naive belief that he was invincible. They crossed into German airspace at 0830 hours. The sky was clear, the morning sun just burning off the haze. Below, the German countryside looked almost peaceful. It was hard to believe this was the same land that had been soaked in blood for 6 years. Then, at 0847 hours, the radio crackled. Bandits. 4 o'clock high. Focke-Wulfs. 6 German fighters, probably the last operational squadron in the region, dove out of the Sunday. They had nothing to lose. Germany was hours from collapse. This was their final mission, too. The dogfight erupted instantly. Mackenzie's wingman called out, "They're on Bright. Kid's in trouble." Mackenzie snapped his head around and saw it. 2 Focke-Wulfs on Lieutenant Bright's tail. Cannons blazing. The young pilot was trying to evade, but he was inexperienced. Panicked. He was about to die. "Bright! Break left and dive! Now!" Mackenzie shouted. I can't. I'm too low. We're only at Do it. God's elevator. Go." There was a pause, maybe 2 seconds, maybe less, where Mackenzie could almost hear the kid thinking, calculating, fighting his fear. Then Bright's voice came back, cracking with terror. "Going in." The P-47 rolled and dove. But Bright had hesitated too long. He was starting from only 8,000 feet. Dangerously low for God's elevator. And Mackenzie knew. The kid didn't have enough altitude. He'd have to pull out so low that the margin of error would be measured in feet, not hundreds of feet. Mackenzie had a choice in that moment. He could stay high, stay safe, and watch young Tommy Bright either pull out successfully or become another crater in Germany. Or he could follow him down. There was no tactical reason to follow, no strategic value. The kid was on his own. That's just how it worked in combat. You can't save everyone. But Mackenzie had lost too many pilots. He'd watched too many men ride God's elevator and not come back. Jimmy Doyle, Wild Bill Harrigan, Carl Hoffman, dozens of others. Some he'd known well. Some were just names on a casualty list. He was tired of losing pilots. "I'm coming with you, Bright," Mackenzie said into his radio, and pushed his stick forward. The 2 P-47 Thunderbolts dove together, a veteran with 97 missions and a kid with 3. Behind them, the German fighters followed, confident of 2 kills. 6,000 feet. 4,000 feet. 2,000 feet. "When do I pull up?" Bright's voice was pure panic now. "Not yet," Mackenzie said, forcing calm into his voice. "Stay with me. Watch my aircraft. When I pull, you pull. 1,000. 500 feet. 1,000 feet." They were over a small German town. Mackenzie could see people in the streets, looking up at the screaming aircraft. Could see clotheslines in backyards. A dog running. 500 feet. The Germans broke off. They wouldn't follow this suicide dive. 300 feet. Now, Mackenzie shouted. Pull! 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 Both pilots hauled back on their control sticks. The G-forces hit like a truck. Mackenzie's vision grayed, then blackened. He was flying blind, trusting muscle memory, trusting instinct, trusting God. The Thunderbolt shuddered, groaned, and obeyed. The nose came up. Mackenzie's vision returned, and he was at 50 feet, flying level, buildings flashing past his wingtips. He looked left. Lieutenant Bright's P-47 was there, also at 50 feet, also level. The kid had made it. They'd both made it. But as Mackenzie's heart rate began to slow, as the adrenaline started to fade, he felt something he'd never felt before in 97 missions. Not relief, not triumph, but a profound, crushing exhaustion. He was done. He couldn't do this anymore. 3 hours later, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. That evening, back at RAF Bodny, there was celebration. Pilots who'd survived the war drank, laughed, cried, and tried to process the fact that they'd never have to fly combat again. Never have to face German fighters. Never have to ride God's elevator. But Mackenzie sat alone in the corner of the officers' club, nursing a whiskey he wasn't drinking. Lieutenant Bright found him there. The kid's face was pale, his hands still shaking. "Sir, I wanted to thank you for following me down. You didn't have to do that." Mackenzie looked at the young pilot for a long moment. Then he said, "Do you know how many times I've used God's elevator, Lieutenant?" "No, sir. 23 times. 23 times I've pushed my aircraft into a near-vertical dive and bet my life that I could pull out before hitting the ground." "Do you want to know what I learned?" Bright nodded. "I learned that God's elevator doesn't care about skill. It doesn't care about experience. It doesn't care about luck. Every time you step into that elevator and press the button marked down, you're rolling dice. And eventually, inevitably, those dice come up snake eyes." He paused, then continued. "I survived 23 rides. Wild Bill Harrigan didn't survive his first. Some men rode it 50 times and walked away. Some rode it once and didn't. There's no logic to it, no fairness, just probability and physics. But we made it today, sir," Bright said quietly. "We did," Mackenzie agreed. "And tomorrow, if the war hadn't ended, we'd have had to do it again. And the day after that. And sooner or later, maybe on the 24th ride, maybe on the 50th, God's elevator would have taken one of us all the way down to the basement. And there's no coming back from the basement." The final statistics of God's elevator were classified for decades. When they were finally released in the 1,970 seconds, the numbers were staggering. Between 1,942 and 1,945, the United States Army Air Forces lost 1,284 fighter aircraft to uncontrolled flight into terrain during combat operations. That's the official terminology for God's elevator failures. 1,284 pilots. 1,284 men who'd survived training, survived the journey to Europe, survived combat missions only to die in a maneuver designed to save their lives. But here's the truly shocking statistic that historians discovered. God's elevator also saved an estimated 3,400 pilots from being shot down by enemy fighters. 3,400 men who would have died if they'd stayed and fought, but who dove instead and lived. So was it worth it? Was God's elevator a life-saving technique or a death trap? The answer, like so many things in war, is both. Captain Robert Mackenzie returned to the United States in June 1945. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal with 15 oak leaf clusters, and the respect of every pilot who'd flown with him. But he never flew again. Not in combat, not recreationally, not even in a small civilian aircraft. When asked why, he'd give different answers to different people. Sometimes he'd say he'd had enough excitement for one lifetime. Sometimes he'd claim he was too busy with civilian life. But in 1987, during an interview for a World War II documentary, "Every time I close my eyes, I still see it. The altimeter spinning backward. The ground rushing up. That moment, that terrible, beautiful moment when you pull back on the stick and you don't know if you're going to make it. I rode God's elevator 23 times, and every single time, I was absolutely certain I was about to die. The fact that I didn't it was a gift. But it was also a burden. Because I survived, and so many others didn't. Why did I pull out when Wild Bill didn't? Why did I make it when Jimmy Doyle gave up? There's no answer, no reason, just luck. And living with that knowledge that the only difference between me and them was random chance, that's something you carry forever. He paused, and the interviewer later said his eyes seemed to be looking at something far away, something only he could see. People ask me if I'd do it again, if I had to. And you know what? I don't know. I honestly don't know. Because God's elevator doesn't just take you down physically. It takes you down mentally, spiritually. Every time you ride it, it takes a piece of you. And after 23 rides, I didn't have many pieces left. Lieutenant Tommy Bright, the young pilot Mackenzie saved on that final mission, became a commercial airline pilot after the war. He flew for 32 years without incident. But he never forgot that moment over Germany, the moment when he dove toward the earth and didn't know if he'd ever pull out. In 1991, at a 352nd Fighter Group reunion, Bright finally asked Mackenzie the question that had haunted him for 46 years. "Sir, when you followed me down that day, did you know we were going to make it?" Mackenzie looked at the man who'd been a terrified 9-year-old kid the last time they'd flown together. He smiled, a sad, knowing smile, and said, "Nobody ever knows if they're going to make it, Tommy. That's why we called it God's elevator. Because once you push that stick forward, your life isn't in your hands anymore. It's in His. And you just have to trust that when you reach the ground floor, He'll let you walk away." He paused, then added, "But here's what I learned after 23 rides. God's elevator always reaches the ground floor. The only question is whether you're still alive when it does."